Hi, I'm Alyce-Kay Ruckelshaus of Threshold of Hineni here in Sweetwater, Tennessee, where we have a huge rainstorm going on. So if you hear a little bit of thunder and lightning, um, that's what's going on. That's kind of what we're famous for here. Anyway, we are on part 5 of our Passover series, and today we're going to be talking about the first two cups. There are 4 cups in the Passover Seder, and they're a very, very important part of the Seder. They are kind of what divides the Seder into its various scenes, I guess you would say, or acts, because the Seder is the retelling of a story, and it's kind of a drama that everybody present participates in, and that's one of the things that makes it fun. I mean, it's not like you get up and act it out, but you read a script that talks about the story in Exodus. It talks about what God did for his people. It has different things like you get to dip your finger in your wine and splatter a drop for each of the 10 plagues. There's just lots of different things to keep children interested and involved. And anyway, so this is divided up by the 4 different cups. And the first cup, which is at the beginning, is the cup of sanctification. And sanctification just simply means set aside to be holy, set apart to be holy. God set his people, Israel, apart to be holy, to be his people. He set us as Christians apart to be holy, to be his people. I don't know if you know, but in the Bible, we're referred to as saints. It's not just, somebody that the Catholic Church has recognized as being really important and has certain qualifications that are saints, but we are all saints because we're all set apart. That doesn't mean that we're perfect. It doesn't even mean that we're good all the time. We make a lot of mistakes. I think sometimes Christians probably make more than anybody else because, of course, Satan wants us to mess up. So we're getting a lot more thrown at us, I think, sometimes. But anyway, so we are set aside, set apart to be holy. And so the beginning of the Passover affirms that. It affirms that we are God's people. And that's why we've gathered here together. That's why we're retelling this story. That's why we praise God. That's why we do all of this. That's what our life is about, that we're set aside to be holy. The second cup comes after a ceremonial washing of hands and a couple of other things. The second cup opens up the main act of the Passover Seder, and that's the cup of instruction. And as I've mentioned in the other videos, the themes of Passover are to remember and to teach, to remember what God brought me out of, because we look at the captivity in Egypt as something that we experienced personally. And for us as Christians, we look at our captivity to sin, our slavery to sin. And we want to remember what that was like and what God brought us out of. So it's to remember, and to remember especially what God has done for us. But it's also to teach. It's to pass that on to our children. And I touched on this a little bit. I think it was in the last video, maybe the one before that, the cycle in the book of Judges. And I want to talk about that a little bit more, because this is why it's so important that we pass these things on to subsequent generations. And this is something that I see our country, I'm American, and I see Christianity in America going through this very cycle right now, where we have failed to teach the subsequent generations about what God has done for us. And anyway, so in the book of Judges in the Bible, you have Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, where they enter the promised land, and then Judges. And the period of the Judges was after Joshua died and up until Samuel, I think you would say. Anyway, it's the period where they didn't yet have a king, and Israel was supposed to be a theocracy. God was the king. What happens though is that God doesn't ever demand our worship. He he allows us to have free will and to do whatever we want, and then there are consequences to that, of course. But what happens is that you have these people who have gone through this fantastic stuff that God has done for them. He's brought them across the Jordan River, a really miraculous thing that we talked about in the Memorial Stone series, and you can find it in Joshua 4, I think. Um, and and he's helped them conquer the land, and just, I mean, incredible stories all through the book of Joshua, and miraculous things that these people have seen. And so, of course, they love God. They want to serve him. They recognize his power. They recognize that they want him on their side, that they want him on their side. And so they worship him, and they're faithful to him, and genuinely loving him. But they fail to pass that on to their children. And so the next generation comes up, and they're not, he's not our God. He's your God, mom and dad. And so they either reject him or just, I'm just not into that kind of thing, like that. And so then what happens is, as a result, they end up being in captivity to another nation who then rules over them and sometimes enslaves them. And then they cry out for help. And when they cry out for help, then God delivers them. And then they've seen all this. And so then they serve God, and then they fail to tell the next generation, and so on and so forth. And you just see the cycle happening over and over and over. And I think that's one of the reasons that we have the book of Judges, is that we can see that cycle. It's for a lot of other reasons too, but I think that's one of the reasons. So the whole thing of teaching our children through the holidays, the holy days that God has set up, is one of the ways, one of the means to continue that love of God and that passion for him, and to avoid that cycle. And so that's why it's important for us to have this aspect of teaching. So like I said, the bulk of the Seder is this cup of instruction. And there are quite a few things that happen during that section. And I'm not going to go through every one of them in detail, but generally one of the things that happens is that, and this is usually the youngest son, is supposed to ask 4 questions, and it's really 5 questions, but 4. It's that Jewish thing that you see in Proverbs. There are 3, blah blah blah. No, 4. That kind of thing. So it's 4 questions, but it's really 5, and it's basically about, why is this night different from all other nights? And so the youngest son asks those. And at the Passover Seders that I do, I usually have 5 different children, so that the more kids participating, the better. And you want them to be young children. So you give those questions to the parents ahead of time so that the children can memorize them, because they're usually not readers at that age. And so they ask these questions, and then they're supposed to listen for when the answer comes, because the answer is going to come sometime in the next hour or so. So it helps to keep their attention. So you have the 4 questions. You also have the 4 types of children. And this is instructional for the children, but it's also instructional for us. Because you talk about, in that section, you talk about the child who doesn't care at all for what he's hearing. And you talk about the child who's eager to learn. And you talk about the child who doesn't really understand yet, and so you're going to pray for understanding, that kind of thing. And so it's instructional, because this is how we are too as an adult, and very possibly we might have been very passionate about the Lord at one time in our life, but we've lost that passion, we've lost that first love. And so hearing about these 4 children is a really important part of the Seder for us, and where it's kind of like, sometimes cartoons are written for children, but if you're an adult watching it, you see things that the kids don't notice that are really funny or really profound. It's kind of like that. This part of the Passover is written primarily for the children. It's supposed to be an instructional thing, but it's very instructional to us too. And we do ourselves a huge disservice if we don't recognize that. Okay, so we've had the 4 questions and the 4 types of children. Then we have the story of the plagues. So this is a big thing, where we start telling the story of how the midwives didn't kill the baby boys, and Moses and Pharaoh and all this stuff. And then we get to the 10 plagues. And we're going to read the list of the 10 plagues, but we have to have our glass of wine or grape juice, whatever it is that you're serving. And we put our finger in, and each time that a plague is mentioned, we take it out and we flick that wine, that drop of wine, onto our plate. So I like taking pictures of the plates throughout the Seder, because the plates evolve and kind of tell the story of what's going on. Later on you have a hard-boiled eggshell and stuff, and so you just see these scraps from the Seder that tell the story in and of themselves, if you know the symbolism. So we have the story of the plagues, and then in my Seder I include Jesus washing his disciples' feet at this point, because it was at the Last Supper that Jesus washed his disciples' feet. We see that in John 13. I'll put that in the description below. But Jesus washed his disciples' feet, and if you remember, Peter wasn't going to let him wash his feet, and because he's like, no, you're the teacher, I'm the servant, but Jesus said, if you don't let me wash your feet, Peter, then you can't be part of me. And Peter said, oh, don't just wash my feet, wash all of me. That's how Peter was, and he's great, and so we have the foot washing. Now that's not part of the Jewish Seder, but I've put that in because I want to give you the context of that, because this is when Jesus did this with his disciples, and we're not really sure at what point in the evening he did that with his disciples, but this point makes sense to me, so that's why I put it in there. It could have been at the very beginning when they first came in to the house where they were going to have the Passover, or what we call the upper room. If you've ever heard of the upper room, that's where Jesus had the Passover, this last Passover, with his disciples. So those are the basic things that take place during this portion of the cup of instruction. And during that time, we have some of the elements that are on the Seder plate, because those help us to tell the story. And so that's what we're going to be talking about in the next video. We've talked about the first 2 cups. We still have 2 more cups to go, but those are after supper. So I want to talk next about the Seder plate elements and what those mean for the Jews and for us. But there was one other thing that I wanted to mention, because this is a question I get a lot of times, is, do we have to have wine? Some Christians don't think that it's okay to drink wine, so don't have wine. If you think that it's wrong, have grape juice or cranberry juice or something. I like the kosher elderberry wine. It is amazing, and it's specifically for Passover, and it's not very strongly alcoholic. My family, when we originally started having Passover, my children were very small, and so I had these little tiny wine glasses for them, and so they got to have a little bit of wine. And one of my daughters, who will remain unnamed, was, I think, 2 years old, and she got drunk on that little tiny bit of wine. So after that, that was one of the reasons why I quit having wine at our Passovers, and we had grape juice instead. The other reason was because we had friends who were alcoholics, and I just didn't feel like it was good to have the alcohol there causing a possible stumbling block for them. And so we didn't have that. And then the other thing is, you drink 4 glasses of wine or grape juice or whatever you're serving, and 2 of those glasses are before you eat anything. So the possibility of getting drunk is very strong, especially if you're not used to drinking wine. I mean, like, I'm not. And I didn't want to be sending people, well, first of all, I don't want to be getting people drunk. And secondly, I didn't want to be sending people out there driving drunk. So for that reason, I usually just use a juice, a grape juice usually, and sometimes cranberry juice. I specifically can't drink grapes. That's why I like the elderberry wine. But so I usually have cranberry juice for myself and for anybody else who can't have grapes for some reason or another. But it doesn't have whatever your church has for communion. That's your best bet, because that's probably going to be the most meaningful to you. And then just don't make a big, huge deal of it. It's not about wine or something. That's not what the point is. The point is about Jesus, about what he did, about what God did in saving us from our sins and in redeeming us from our slavery to sin. This is the point. So stick to that as the point, please, please, please. And, and you'll get so much more out of it. But try not to be offensive. Think about your guests. Be really considerate of them, and pray about it. Of course, that's the thing that I should have said first, actually, was pray about it, because God will give you the answers. So again, the first two cups are the cup of sanctification, that we're set apart to be holy. The second is the cup of instruction. And in our next video, we are going to talk about the elements of the Seder plate itself. All right, I love you all. Goodbye. See you next time.